Well, around the country at the moment, as you've seen, higher education institutions now planning to take hundreds of thousands of young people to start the academic year. But as you know, a huge pressing need for higher education, and there are many people who also need help from the National Student Financial Aid Scheme to pay their fees to get enough food while they study. Professor Jonathan Jansen is a professor of education at the University of Stellenbosch. Professor, good afternoon to you. It can seem almost as if the pressure on our higher education system is growing year after year, that the pressure is getting worse. Is that really the case?
It is the case, and when you have record numbers of students qualifying for university entrance, then you're going to have this happen, and some of these issues have never been resolved. I remember when I was a dean years ago, you had students simply showing up on the day of registration. They never applied, they haven't sought funding, and they appear at the gate of the university, and then suddenly, of course, there's a bit of a crisis, right? So there is an expectation among many students that because I got a bachelor's pass, you should take me in. It is not an unreasonable expectation in general, but it becomes a major problem when universities have systems, deadlines, application details that must be respected. And when you don't respect that, it causes a huge, bottleneck at the gates of a university.
We have more universities than we've ever actually had before. In the last decade, we've seen several opening. At the same time, of course, the number of people coming through the matric system has also been increasing. I presume we still just don't have enough space for learners, for all of those who could study, who qualify to study, who've done well enough to study. We just don't have enough space.
No, I don't think that's the problem. I think there's enough space. The problem is we have too many students graduating with poor passes. Remember, most of these students in the first year, more than half of them will fail, and a large percentage won't get to a 3-year degree within 5 years. So the problem is not churning out more students with weak passes. The problem is making sure that the foundations of education, where the problem is real. Remember, not too long ago, every media form reported correctly that 81% of kids in grade 4 can't read. So we've not addressed that problem, at the foundations, in the foundations of education. We've tried to correct it by inflating the marks of students at the terminal end of this long chain. So I don't believe we need more universities. We need students with much better high school passes who have a much greater chance of success in university education, and that is the problem. But you simply can't fit a growing bulge of weaker and weaker students every year into tertiary education, and then when they don't get in, there's chaos on the one hand, and then you have this glib response, where people who don't know how higher ed works to say, oh, why don't you go to a college and become an electrician or something like that?
It's interesting because, we've been talking about the high failure rate in first year for at least 30 years. A very long time ago. And yet the problem seems to be getting worse.
Yeah, the problem is getting worse because we're putting in weaker and weaker students. And this bizarre spectacle is so sickening, where the minister gets up and says, the system is stabilizing, the school system. That's a bald-faced lie. The system is not stabilizing. The system is crumbling at its foundations. And so what we've tried to do is to make sure that by the time kids get to grade 12, that very few of them get there because of the huge dropout rate from grade 2 onwards, but especially between grades 10 and 12, right? And now for this limited group of students who pass with 30 and 40% in some subjects, who boast when they get a 7, which is an A in life orientation, which is completely meaningless subject, and who, most of whom are so poor in mathematics that the numbers of students with mathematical literacy are sort of balloon, but they get over with a bachelor's pass. This is the problem. We're not solving, and there's a political reason for this, of course. One is I don't think the ANC knows how to solve the systemic crisis in schooling. They just don't know how. So what do? You play this little game with public perception by having these fake results at the end of grade 12. In the meantime, as you know, almost half of the children who started off with schooling will never see grade 12, and most of those with bachelor's passes in grade 12 will never see the inside of the university.
Once learners get to university, it's a very, in a way, depressing picture that you paint, Professor, but I think in a way we all know where it comes from. When people get to university, and we spend quite a lot of money on higher education, if you look at NSFAS, if you look at the money that goes directly to universities, if you look at the money that students' families, those that can afford it, actually put into a university education as well, we're spending a big chunk of money on higher education every year. Are we spending that money effectively?
No, we're not. We're not spending it effectively in terms of getting to your goals, and we're not spending it efficiently, as economists would call it, in terms of turning resources into results in a very efficient way. We're not. So we're playing games. Don't forget that universities put in millions and millions of rands per university every single year, just trying to make up for the gaps. We used to call it academic development, for the gaps that students bring with them into engineering or into medicine or into law. And so everybody's spending a lot of money, and the tragedy, as you correctly infer, is that poor parents scramble to get money together just to get the kid through the gate of the university, and then we all fail them. I really don't think that's fair.
You've written a whole book about the actual corruption in higher education that we've seen over the years. Some of the examples that you've mentioned are utterly astounding. People with money in boots, people with private lifts, people having to really look after the sort of degree plate so that they can't fake degrees, things like that. Is there any reason to believe that we're better at stopping that corruption in higher education institutions now?
No, I don't think so. And let's look at where you have big pots of money at the moment. Think of NSFAS. It is, you're talking about billions, not millions, right? The level of wastage there, just in terms of a simple thing, that getting an adequate amount of money to a student on time in order for her to be able to buy books, attend classes, and so on. That whole thing has been corrupted, as we've seen, and there's been an administrator already, and we're not able to solve that problem. And so, what I always worry about is this sort of turning the attention of politics and protest onto university administration, and sometimes that's necessary. But that's not where your problem lies. Your problem lies in a system that has, in a wholesale manner, failed our students in the very simple task that you and I as taxpayers, you put your money there with the understanding that this money would go to public services, including making sure that every student who is talented but in need can get their money on time. Something that's, how easy it is to solve that problem. But we won't solve it because then you're taking away, a feeding trough for the vultures that sit and watch and wonder about how they can look off young people's futures.
I presume, despite everything that you say, it's still worth sending your child to university if you can?
Look, I say to parents all the time that if your child has done well and you have the funding, don't send them overseas if you can, if you will. We still have some of the best universities in the world. As you know, among our top 6 or 7 universities, they're ranked among the very best. They do so despite the enormous difficulties of running a university in an African country, given our relative lack of resources compared to the Ivy Leagues or to the Oxford system and so on. We do fairly well in giving students a solid undergraduate education. But why must we make it so difficult for them? Why must, what I mean? And so, but I'm not blaming universities. I'm not blaming alone. I'm not blaming government alone. I'm blaming the public for not putting pressure on government to solve the chain, that long chain, from preschool, by the way, through the foundation years, through the matric years, into the first year universities. But you can't obsess with the problem at the end of that long chain. You have to solve it at the foundations of the education system.
There's another aspect to all of this, Professor, and I realize you're a professor of education, but I'd appreciate your view on this, which is that we see universities, and you'll know this, it's like the festive season road deaths. You know, it's a sort of seasonal story at the beginning of the year. In 2 weeks' time, unfortunately, we'll probably be doing student protests for a week, and then the sort of issue will move away. But we need our institutions to do more than to educate people. We need them to conduct research. As a country, as you know, probably better than I, we have pressing needs, pressing problems that we need research. We need to find some solutions to those problems. I've always thought for some researchers, South Africa must be the best possible laboratory, and there's such a need to have those problems solved that it must be very rewarding to work on those problems. Are institutions still able to conduct that research that could solve some of the problems we face?
Yeah, I mean, I must remind you that, we discovered the Omicron variant during the pandemic in Southern Africa, in Botswana and South Africa. I must tell you that in one of our universities, a single person, discovered genes affecting heart rhythms and all of those things. I must tell you that here at Stellenbosch, at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, with the Karims, we have the leading scientists, in the context of predicting future pandemics and dealing with them when they come. We have had Nobel laureates come to our universities. Here's the difficulty, I can tell you, as an active researcher. The more your attention is diverted to dealing with the problem at the gates of the university, you know what I mean? The less time and attention. What a researcher needs is a place of relative tranquility, a place in which you can focus on your research, a place that is attractive to investors to give money for research. And so increasingly, I think, the most successful researchers, I mentioned Caprisa, for example, at KZN, are relatively independent from physically separated problems, the day-to-day troubles of universities. And I hope it doesn't get to that for our leading scholars and researchers, because what you want is a vibrant. A university is not a college. It's not just there to teach people, as much as I enjoy teaching young people. It is also there to break ground, discover new things, and publish that in the best sources in the world and make an impression. This is Africa's only country in which you have so many talented scholars, some of the most highly cited in the world, who can, in fact, take their place proudly within the community of the science community, and so on. So you're quite right that there is a cost to science and to scientific discovery when we become involved in these seasonal, kinds of dilemmas when it comes to simple things like admission and funding of students.
Professor Jonathan Jansen, thank you. Professor of Education at the University of Stellenbosch. Really appreciate the views.